Summer in North Carolina has a distinct heat that is hard to mistake. In the days of August, the air is always thick, the sunlight piercing through the dense forest canopy, creating shimmering patterns on the ground. On one hot and humid Tuesday morning, Thomas Johnson, a black man with over 20 years of experience in law enforcement, was preparing for his first day in a new role: chief of police for the neighborhood of Green Hill. Green Hill was a small, quiet town nestled between green hills and surrounded by the vast fields of North Carolina. It wasn't the kind of place one would expect to need an experienced and decisive police chief like Thomas. But it was precisely the tranquility that allowed negative behaviors and corruption to easily creep into the local police force. Thomas knew this wasn't going to be an easy task. Thomas stood in front of the mirror, looking at himself in his checkered shirt, faded jeans, and worn-out sneakers. The casual attire didn't resemble the look of a police chief, but he chose it for his own reasons. Thomas wanted to walk into the police station without anyone knowing who he was, so he could see the truth, what was happening when no chief was around to oversee. "Take it easy, Thomas," he whispered to himself, smiling faintly. He knew that someone like him, with a humble background and a different skin color, would face many challenges in assuming a leadership role within the police force. But Thomas wouldn't let that deter him. He had overcome countless obstacles to get to this point, and nothing would stop him from continuing down the path he had chosen. He stepped out of the house, immediately feeling the heat and humidity of the early morning. The old police car was parked in the driveway. He opened the door and settled into the driver's seat. He knew that Green Hill needed reform, needed a leader who was willing to confront the issues it faced. But to do that, he first needed to understand the current situation, something he could only observe if he remained unrecognized. The parking lot of the Green Hill police station was packed with officers' cars this morning. Thomas parked in a secluded corner and observed from a distance. Officers in their dark blue uniforms were bustling into the building, some chatting and laughing, others passing by each other without much care. Thomas noticed a group of officers gathered in a small circle, casually chatting next to a patrol car. They were laughing and seemed completely unaware of their surroundings. Thomas decided to step out of his car and walk toward the building, trying to blend in with the crowd and avoid drawing attention. He entered through a side entrance, where fewer people were passing by. The smell of stale coffee wafted from the break room inside. The sound of ringing phones, clacking keyboards, and the laughter of officers filled the air, creating a busy yet relaxed atmosphere. Thomas observed closely, trying to catch every small detail: how people interacted, their expressions, and especially the words they said when they didn't realize they were being watched. No one paid attention to Thomas, which gave him more opportunity to observe. He walked slowly past the desks, noting how the staff treated each other. Some groups were standing close, seriously discussing work, while others seemed interested only in casual conversations, with bursts of laughter ringing out. As Thomas was walking past the break room, a sharp voice called out from behind him, making him stop. "Hey, you there!" The voice was full of authority and a hint of mockery. Thomas turned around to see a white officer approaching him, his expression smug. The officer's name tag read Wallace. "What are you doing here? This isn't a place for drifters," Wallace said, his tone dripping with contempt. Behind him, a few other officers stood watching, their eyes glinting with amusement. Thomas looked into Wallace's eyes, trying to stay calm. He opened his mouth to say something, but Wallace didn't give him the chance. "Did you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need your kind hanging around," Wallace said louder, ensuring the entire break room could hear. Laughter erupted from the group watching, their faces filled with derision. Thomas felt a surge of anger rising inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew he was facing a real challenge, a challenge he needed to overcome not with anger, but with patience and determination. As Thomas was still trying to think of how to respond, Wallace moved closer, his face full of satisfaction. Suddenly, Wallace spat directly into Thomas's face. the hot spit running down his cheek. Everything seemed to freeze for a moment. Thomas felt his breath catch, his entire body tensing up. The laughter around him grew louder, and one of the officers even slapped a table, laughing hysterically. Thomas could hear someone muttering something about showing useless people their place. He felt his heart pounding. This humiliation was not just directed at him personally, but it was also a challenge to the values he had spent his entire life defending. But Thomas knew he couldn't allow himself to lose control. He slowly pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, wiping the spit from his face, each movement calm and deliberate. "Is this how you treat everyone who steps in here?" Thomas asked, his voice steady but filled with gravity. Wallace smirked. "Only those who don't deserve any better." The laughter erupted again, but Thomas said nothing more. He just looked at Wallace, his gaze cold, and then turned away, leaving the mocking laughter behind him. Thomas walked toward the main office of the police station, his heart still pounding. He knew this moment would serve as a lesson for everyone here, a lesson they would never forget. He felt the chill in the meeting room as he stepped inside, sensing the tension in the air. It was time to introduce himself, and he knew this meeting would change everything. Thomas Johnson walked down the long hallway, feeling the curious and vague glances of some of the police staff as he passed by. But Thomas paid them no attention. His mind was entirely focused on the upcoming meeting. This was the moment he would need to show decisiveness and his composure. But above all, he would shed light on what had been happening inside the Green Hill police station. The meeting room of the police station was a large space with many chairs and tables neatly arranged, illuminated by fluorescent lights that made everything brightly visible, almost exposed. On the podium, an older officer, whom Thomas knew as Captain James Harris, stood ready to conduct the meeting. Thomas stood for a moment behind a side door, staying out of sight. He carefully observed the scene in the room. Officers began entering, some carrying coffee cups, others joking with each other. The atmosphere in the room remained relaxed, filled with laughter and chatter. Thomas easily spotted Wallace standing on the far side of the room, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, his face still smug. His colleagues were talking about something, and Thomas heard a few laughs from the group. Captain Harris stood at the center, raising his voice to command attention. "All right, everyone, quiet down. We have an important introduction today." The chatter gradually subsided, and the officers began to listen attentively. Thomas stepped forward, his shoes echoing steadily on the stone-tiled floor. The meeting room fell silent as Thomas approached the podium. A hush spread across the room as every officer's eyes turned toward him. Captain Harris continued, "As most of you are aware, Chief Caldwell retired last month, and today, I am very pleased to introduce our new leader, someone with an impressive background and a vision for our police department." Harris turned to Thomas, motioning for him to step up to the podium. Without hesitation, Thomas walked up and placed his briefcase with the official seal of the police department on the lectern. He looked across the room, his eyes lingering a moment longer when they reached Wallace. Wallace no longer looked smug. Shock was evident on his face, and Thomas could see beads of sweat starting to form on his forehead. "Good morning, colleagues," Thomas began, his deep and powerful voice resonating throughout the room. "My name is Thomas Johnson, and from today, I am your new police chief." The atmosphere in the room seemed to freeze. Silence fell over everyone. The astonished and uneasy looks on the faces of those present were unmistakable. Wallace no longer held his confident demeanor. His head bowed, his face flushed with embarrassment. A few officers glanced at each other, whispering something in hushed, anxious tones. Thomas continued, his voice full of determination. "When I arrived here this morning, I deliberately chose not to wear my uniform because I wanted to see this police department through an unfiltered lens, the most honest lens possible." Thomas paused for a moment, letting his words sink into the minds of everyone in the room. "What I witnessed this morning has left me disappointed. There were actions that were not only unprofessional but also entirely unacceptable. And let me make one thing very clear. The culture that has been allowed to thrive here, the lack of respect and the attitude of disdain, ends today. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but Thomas raised his hand, calling for silence. He looked into each person's eyes, his face showing nothing but seriousness. In the short time I've been here, I've seen behavior that is not only unprofessional but demonstrates a fundamental lack of respect for others. Today, I want all of you to understand that respect is not optional. It is the foundation of what we do. Without respect, we are not only failing each other but also failing the community we serve. He let the silence linger for a moment longer, watching as the officers in the room squirmed under the tension. Wallace now looked like a cornered animal, his eyes avoiding Thomas's gaze, his hands beginning to clench. This morning, some of you laughed while watching a man whom you thought had no authority being humiliated. But let me remind you of something. Every person who walks through this door deserves respect, whether they are wearing a uniform or not. Thomas's words cut through the atmosphere in the room like a sharp blade. No one dared to move. No one dared to speak. Thomas let the silence stretch on, allowing everyone to fully absorb what he had just said. Thomas stepped down from the podium, moving toward Wallace with slow but powerful strides. Each step echoed in the silence, heightening the tension. Wallace stood there, looking like a man cornered. When Thomas stopped in front of him, Wallace's eyes avoided his, and his feet seemed ready to retreat. "Officer Wallace." Thomas called his name, his voice clear and ice-cold. Wallace flinched, his shoulders trembling slightly. "You represent everything that has caused this police department to lose the trust of the community. When you spat in my face, you didn't just insult me, you insulted the very badge we wear on our chests. A badge that represents protection, fairness, and respect." Wallace opened his mouth as if to say something, but Thomas didn't give him the chance. "And that's the problem with you, Wallace. You don't care. You didn't consider who was standing in front of you because, in your mind, that person had no worth. That lack of care and respect is exactly why this police department has lost the trust of the people." The atmosphere in the room grew stifling. Everyone was silent. Some didn't even dare to breathe too loudly. Wallace bowed his head, his face flushed, beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead. Thomas turned back to face the room, his voice rising. "What I witnessed this morning was not just the failure of one person but an entire culture. A culture where bullying and prejudice are tolerated, even encouraged. But that ends today." He stepped back to the podium, standing tall, his voice growing sharper. "I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just on the streets but also within the walls of police stations like this. Change isn't easy, and it won't happen overnight. But I promise you, as long as I'm here, this department will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability." Thomas paused, his eyes sweeping across the room once more. Then he nodded to Captain Harris, concluding his speech. "Effective immediately, Officer Wallace is suspended, and there will be an internal investigation into his conduct. And for those of you who think this is just a light punishment, think again. This is just the beginning of the changes to come." Murmurs rose from the back. A few people exhaled sharply, fear evident on their faces. Wallace stood motionless, his face bright red, his lips pressed into a thin line. Thomas remained unshaken, standing tall, his gaze steadfast. "This is not about punishment," Thomas said, his voice deep but powerful. "This is about setting a standard. If you're not willing to rise to that standard, then this place is not for you." He looked around the room one last time, his eyes meeting those of each officer, and everyone felt the weight of his words. "If you're ready to do better, to be better, then we'll move forward together. But remember, I will hold you accountable every step of the way." As the meeting ended, the air remained heavy. The officers quietly left the room without saying a word to each other. Thomas stayed at the podium for a while, watching Wallace leave, his face filled with shame and anger. The other officers avoided his gaze. Each with a different expression, some showed regret. Others seemed deep in thought. Thomas knew this was only the beginning. Attitudes and mindsets that had been ingrained for a long time wouldn't change easily. And he understood that not everyone would be willing to change. But he hadn't come to Green Hill to make friends. He had come to make a difference. And he wouldn't back down. After the meeting ended, Thomas walked back to his office, where he sat down in an old leather chair, lost in thought. A small battle had ended, but a longer war awaited. He knew he had to start by setting an example, not just with words, but with actions. Thomas picked up the phone and called the internal affairs team. He requested that they immediately begin the investigation into Officer Wallace's conduct. This behavior could not be ignored, and he had to ensure that Wallace was held accountable for his actions. By early afternoon, a quick board meeting was held to approve the decision to suspend Wallace. Thomas sat among his new colleagues, looking at each person and seeing the tension in their eyes. Some seemed anxious, perhaps fearful of the changes and concerned about their own future in the department. Eventually, the decision to suspend Wallace was approved. Thomas exhaled in relief, but he knew this was only the first step. He needed to change a system that had existed for far too long, accepting negative behaviors like Wallace's. He knew that one disciplinary decision couldn't change an entire organization. But at the very least, it was the first step in sending a message that no negative behavior would be tolerated. In the days following Thomas's introduction, the Green Hill police station was no longer the same. Officers entered the headquarters with a palpable tension. They could no longer be comfortable with disrespectful behavior or gossiping about trivial matters. Everything changed when Thomas began patrolling the station each day. Thomas didn't want to be a leader who just sat in an office giving orders. He wanted to see the daily lives of the officers, to directly hear their stories and concerns. He often walked through the hallways, visited the smaller offices, and talked to each officer in a friendly manner. However, the tense atmosphere hadn't completely dissipated, especially since everyone knew he was conducting internal investigations. Many officers began to worry about their futures. Those who had previously supported or encouraged Wallace's behavior no longer dared to show the same attitude. They knew that all eyes were watching, and they understood that Thomas was not someone easily fooled. However, not everyone was against change. There were those who, though initially skeptical, began to notice the difference Thomas was making. The younger officers, especially those new to the force, felt more motivated to work with integrity and responsibility. One morning, as Thomas was walking down the hallway to check on things, he saw Officer Maria Lopez standing in the reception area. Maria was one of the youngest officers on the team. She had bright eyes and a serious demeanor, but Thomas could sense that she had been forced to stay silent in the face of injustice. Afraid of retaliation, as Thomas approached, Maria turned and looked at him with hesitation. Thomas smiled gently, signaling that he was willing to listen. Maria stepped closer, her voice shaky but clear. "Chief, I want to talk to you," Maria said, her eyes meeting his with determination. "Of course, let's go to my office," Thomas replied, his voice soft. Once they were inside the office, Maria sat down, her hands trembling slightly, but she tried to stay calm. She began recounting the things she had witnessed during her time at the station: bullying, derogatory remarks, and the fear of standing up against those things. "I know that sometimes I was wrong to stay silent," Maria said, her eyes welling with tears. "But I was really scared that I'd be retaliated against if I spoke up." Thomas listened without interrupting. Knowing this was a big step for Maria, he understood her fear, and he knew that she probably wasn't the only one feeling this way. "Maria, I am very grateful for your courage today," Thomas said, his voice warm and sincere. "The most important thing is that we have to start somewhere. You don't need to feel guilty for what happened in the past. Focus on what we can do from now on. You are ready for change. And that's all I need." Maria smiled, a gentle smile filled with hope. "I want to do better, Chief. I want to be a better person." "That's exactly what I expect from all of you," Thomas replied, his eyes shining with conviction. While some officers began to change and wanted to do better, there were still those who were not ready to accept the changes. Wallace, after being suspended, decided to appeal. He claimed that the suspension was unfair and accused Thomas of simply trying to show off his power. Thomas wasn't surprised by Wallace's actions. He knew that people like him wouldn't accept defeat easily, and Wallace would certainly find any way to retaliate. However, Thomas was prepared for any situation. He wasn't afraid of confrontation, and he certainly wouldn't let Wallace escape responsibility. The internal investigation began. Wallace's old records were reviewed. Previous complaints about his behavior, reports of excessive use of force, and derogatory remarks made during his duties, all were collected and carefully analyzed. Thomas knew that to change a system that had rotted from within, he needed to confront people like Wallace. He not only had to remove bad actors from the organization but also rebuild trust among the officers and trust from the community. Eventually, Wallace's appeal was denied. The evidence of his misconduct was too clear. Wallace was terminated, and this sent a strong message to all other members of the Green Hill Police Department. Thomas would not allow anyone on his team to act without accountability, and fairness would be upheld in every situation. Thomas stood in front of his office, looking out the window, watching Wallace leave the police station with a face hardened by anger. Wallace knew that his career had ended here, and he could no longer return to the uniform he had proven himself unworthy of. Thomas sighed, but he felt a sense of relief. He knew this was only the first step, but it was a step in the right direction. He turned back to his office, preparing for the tasks ahead, knowing that the road before him was still long and full of challenges. In the days following Wallace's termination, Thomas Johnson knew he couldn't stop there. Removing one individual wouldn't solve the entire problem, and he needed to delve deeper into the culture of the entire Green Hill Police Department. He convened the internal affairs team, asking them to investigate not only Wallace's behavior but also to expand the investigation across the entire department. He needed to know who had supported the misconduct, who had ignored the complaints and cries for help from the community, and who genuinely wanted to improve. The investigation went on for several weeks, and what was uncovered truly surprised Thomas. It turned out that Wallace wasn't the only one in the department with a history of misconduct. There were other officers who, though not as blatant as Wallace, had complaints related to excessive use of force or disrespectful attitudes toward the community. Notably, some higher-ranking officers, those who were supposed to set an example for the team, appeared to have used their power to cover up wrongdoing. One late afternoon, as the light outside the window faded, Thomas sat in his office. In front of him, stacks of files filled with evidence and reports. He felt a heavy burden, but he also knew this was an opportunity to make real change. What he had read made him realize that the Green Hill Police Department needed a major overhaul, and he had to be the one to initiate it. Thomas decided there could be no more tolerance for any misconduct. He called an emergency meeting with the entire staff. In the meeting, Thomas spoke candidly about the findings of the investigation, and he emphasized that anyone who continued to deliberately violate policies would face serious consequences. Thomas knew that change could not come solely from firing those who had done wrong. What he needed to do was change the culture of the police department, a culture that had gone unchecked for too long, where disrespect and abuse of power were tolerated. He decided to organize mandatory training sessions on respect and fair treatment for all staff. Thomas invited outside experts to the police department to conduct these training sessions. The lessons were not just about laws and regulations, but also delved into topics like unconscious bias, the importance of empathy, and how to interact with the community. He wanted the officers not only to work with a sense of responsibility but to understand that their job was to serve and protect everyone, regardless of race, class, or circumstance. First, the training sessions were not easy. Many officers still held onto their prejudices, feeling that it was unnecessary to learn how to respect someone they deemed undeserving. However, Thomas was persistent. He understood that not everyone would change immediately, and not everyone would be willing to change. But he believed that if he created an environment where disrespect was no longer tolerated, at least the younger officers, those new to the force, would learn the right values from the start. During the training sessions, Thomas always made an effort to be present and participate alongside the officers. He wanted them to see that he wasn't just giving orders but was also willing to face the challenges with them. He shared stories from his own life about how he faced discrimination as a young officer, how he overcame those obstacles, and held on to his values. Thomas's words gradually made some officers feel more empathetic and open. After making the initial changes within the police department, Thomas realized that to truly rebuild trust, he needed to go further. He decided to start meeting with the community, the people that the police department was meant to serve. Thomas understood that there was no better way to build trust than by listening to those directly affected. Thomas organized a meeting at the Green Hill Neighborhood Community Center. The residents, initially cautious and distrustful, gradually began to show up. Some brought signs demanding justice, while others came with curious expressions. They wanted to know who this new police chief was and whether he was genuinely committed to change. As the meeting began, Thomas stepped onto the stage and greeted everyone with a sincere smile. He thanked them for coming and openly shared the challenges the police department had faced and continued to face. He acknowledged that things had happened in the past that had led to the community losing trust in the police, and he committed to doing everything he could to change that. A middle-aged man stood up, his eyes filled with skepticism. He said that he had lost faith in the police a long time ago, that he and his family had suffered injustice at the hands of officers who did not respect citizens' rights. Thomas listened to every word without interruption, feeling the anger and frustration in the man's voice. Thomas stepped down from the stage, walked over to the man, and looked him straight in the eye. "I cannot change what happened in the past," Thomas said, his voice sincere, "but I am here today to tell you and everyone that we are working to make a change. If you have any issues that need addressing, if you need a reliable police officer, I will be here to listen." The man looked at Thomas for a long time, his eyes seeming to soften a little. "We'll see if you keep your word, Chief Johnson," he said, his voice filled with challenge. Thomas smiled and nodded. "I will do my best to prove it." After several months of persistence, the Green Hill Police Department had undergone significant changes. The atmosphere in the department was no longer heavy. The mocking laughter and disrespectful behavior had nearly vanished. Those who had supported Wallace now felt that they no longer had a place in the new environment. A few decided to resign, unwilling to accept the changes Thomas had brought. Thomas did not try to keep them. He knew that those unwilling to change did not belong on his team. The new officers brought in to replace those who had resigned were young, enthusiastic, and eager to learn. They were trained by Thomas and other senior officers on the importance of respect and serving the community. Thomas saw in their eyes a determination and a belief in justice, which gave him hope. One morning, as Thomas was walking down the hallway of the police station, he met Officer Maria Lopez. She had changed a lot since their first conversation. Now, Maria was more confident. Her eyes brightened when she saw Thomas. "Chief, I want to thank you for giving me the chance to change," Maria said, her voice filled with sincerity. "The training sessions and your support have helped me realize what I can do to become better." Thomas smiled and nodded. "That is exactly what I want to see in everyone on our team. Maria, keep up the good work. And never forget why we're here." That afternoon, Thomas received a phone call from a mother in the community. She shared that her son had had terrible experiences with the police in the past, and she wanted to thank him for what the Green Hill Police Department was doing to change. She said that her son had met Thomas at the community meeting and had started to see the police differently since then. "He used to say he would never trust the police, but after meeting you, He's changed his mind, she said over the phone, her voice full of emotion. Thank you for giving my son hope. Thomas put the phone down after the call ended, his heart filled with emotion. He knew that these changes might not be monumental, but they were important. Every small step brought hope and was a sign that his work was having a positive impact. Looking out of his office window, Thomas saw the officers preparing for their next shift. The laughter and conversations were no longer filled with ridicule or disrespect, but were instead sincere exchanges between colleagues. Thomas knew that the road ahead was still long and full of challenges, but he believed that with every step. The Green Hill Police Department was becoming a place where people could place their trust and hope. As time passed, the Green Hill Police Department began to see noticeable positive changes. Younger officers, like Officer Maria Lopez, had truly committed themselves to transformation and progress. But Thomas Johnson knew that not everyone in the department was willing to accept change. He was well aware that some members of his team, though not openly resistant, still harbored prejudices and silent opposition. One day, as Thomas was reviewing records and reports, a senior officer knocked on the door and entered his office. It was Officer Philip Barnes, who had worked at the department for over 15 years. Barnes was an older man with a conservative personality. He was proud of his experience and sometimes dismissed the ideas of change that Thomas brought. Barnes stood in front of Thomas's desk, his eyes locked on the chief, his discomfort evident. Chief Johnson, I want to talk to you about the changes you're implementing, Barnes said, his tone challenging. Thomas sat up straight, his gaze calm but unwavering. Go ahead, Barnes. I'm listening. Barnes sighed, stepping closer to the desk and placing his hands on it. You know, I've been here for over 15 years, and I know every corner of this department. I don't deny that some officers like Wallace had their issues, but you're trying to change everything too quickly. Not all of us can accept that. Thomas nodded, understanding clearly. Barnes, I know that change is never easy, especially when it goes against what we've been used to for so long. But remember, we're here to serve the community, and to do that, we need to be better. Barnes remained silent, a hint of hesitation in his eyes. But these training sessions, these constant meetings, not everyone wants to hear this. Johnson, many of us feel like we're being lectured, as if we don't know how to do our jobs. Thomas looked deep into Barnes's eyes, his voice firm and steady. I'm not here to lecture anyone, Barnes. I'm here to ensure that we all share the same goal, to protect and serve with respect and responsibility. If you feel that what I'm doing is lecturing, perhaps you should ask yourself why that is. Barnes looked down, his shoulders slumping slightly. Thomas understood that for people like Barnes, change was not just about altering procedures but about transforming their entire mindset. Something deeply ingrained over many years. He knew he couldn't force it, but he also knew he couldn't give up. While some, like Barnes, were still hesitant, younger officers like Maria Lopez had truly begun to shine. Maria was no longer the shy and anxious young officer she used to be. Now, she had become one of the most energetic and passionate members of the department. One afternoon, Maria walked into Thomas's office with a determined expression. She wanted to share an idea she had been considering for a long time. Chief, I want to organize a workshop at the local high school to talk to the students about police work and the importance of respect, Maria said, her voice filled with excitement. Thomas was surprised but very pleased with the suggestion. He understood that building trust within the community had to start with the smallest things, and reaching out to students was a very sensible step. That's a wonderful idea, Maria. I fully support you in this, Thomas said, offering her an encouraging smile. What will you need to make this plan happen? I'll support you in any way I can. Maria beamed, and she began to outline her plan in detail. She wanted to create a space where students could ask any questions they had about police work. And she wanted them to understand that police officers were not only law enforcers but also protectors and supporters of the community. After several weeks of preparation, The workshop took place at Green Hill High School. Maria, along with a few other young officers, came to the school and started the session. At first, the students seemed reserved, but under Maria's friendly and approachable guidance, the atmosphere gradually became more open. The students began to ask questions, ranging from innocent inquiries about the daily life of a police officer to deeper questions about how the police deal with discrimination and violence. Maria answered each question sincerely and responsibly. She shared her story about how she had once remained silent in the face of injustice and how now she wanted to do better. Maria's story moved many of the students, and she knew this was only the beginning. After the workshop, Thomas noticed that connecting with the community was gradually yielding results. People began to see changes at the Green Hill Police Department. They started feeling the difference, and the trust that had once been lost was slowly being restored. One day, Thomas received a letter from a young mother in the community. In the letter, she wrote about how she used to feel scared whenever she saw police officers patrolling near her neighborhood, due to terrible experiences in the past. But after meeting Maria and the young officers at the workshop, she felt that maybe the Green Hill Police Department was truly changing. She thanked Thomas for what he had done for the community, and especially for bringing hope to her son. As Thomas read the letter, his heart filled with emotion. He knew that the path to change was never easy, and there would be many challenges ahead. But the gratitude from the community, the hopeful eyes of the students, these were the motivations that kept him moving forward. One weekend evening, as Thomas stood in the main hallway of the Green Hill Police Department, watching his officers prepare for their next shift, he could feel a distinct change in the atmosphere. The laughter now was no longer mocking or sarcastic, but a genuine exchange of camaraderie and connection among colleagues. The officers worked with confidence and responsibility, understanding that their job was not only to enforce the law but also to protect and respect everyone in the community. Thomas walked over to a group of young officers chatting among themselves. They greeted him with friendly smiles and eyes full of respect. Officer Maria Lopez, her face bright with enthusiasm, stepped forward and said, "Chief, we're getting ready for the night patrol. We'll do our best to keep everyone safe." Thomas nodded, looking at Maria and her teammates. "I trust you all. Maria, do your best. And remember that every action we take can make a difference for someone." Maria and the other young officers responded in unison. "Yes, Chief." They quickly went on their way to carry out their duties, leaving Thomas standing there watching them with pride. He knew that the road ahead would still be full of challenges. There would always be those unwilling to accept change, always new obstacles that he and the team would have to face. But he believed that with each step, each small effort, the Green Hill Police Department was becoming a place people could trust. Thomas returned to his office, sat down in his chair, and opened a drawer. Taking out a notebook, he wrote a simple line in it: "Change begins with patience and determination." He knew this wasn't just a slogan but a belief and a principle he would carry for the rest of his life. That night, sitting alone in his quiet office, Thomas felt a sense of peace within himself. He knew he had done the right thing. He had chosen the difficult path, but it was the only path he could take, the path of respect, fairness, and real change. Thomas leaned back in his chair, looking out the window where the streetlights shone in the night. He smiled, a smile of hope and determination. The road ahead was long, but with the support of his team and the community, Thomas believed that he and the Green Hill Police Department would overcome every challenge together, to become true guardians of justice and peace.